Do you like webcomics? Wait, you're here. Of course you like webcomics. But do you really like webcomics and you just won't stop talking about them? Then hop on over to hivemill.com because Chris B just made the most beautiful shirt and it says, I will not shut up about webcomics. This is a threat. If you visit hivemill.com, you can find it under Studio Cartridges listings or pop webcomic threat into the search bar and it'll bring you right to it. Thanks for listening to us not shut up about webcomics, and thanks for supporting our hosts. Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today, we are going to be jamming about layer styles in digital art programs and all the cool stuff they can do for you. I'm Delphina. I use she, her pronouns, and I make the webcomic Zombulus.
I am Rennie. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomic Kate Blast.
And I'm Verathane. I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomics Travolta and Witchwood.
Awesome. So, layers are a feature of digital art programs like Clip Studio, Photoshop, Paint Toolside, just about any art program. If you look around the dashboard or under one of the menus, you'll probably find them. And understanding how to structure layers for sketches, effects, and other things can save you work or time or just add an extra oomph to whatever you're working on. So, we're going to talk about them because they're pretty awesome. I mean, I use layers all the time. I have a million layers. Do you guys have a million layers or just like a couple? What is your level of layer chaos?
I've seen layer counts you people wouldn't believe.
Oh
Oh, you'd
no.
be surprised what I can believe.
My layer counts typically for most of my pieces get well above 50 per piece usually, and then for actual like comic pages they get so high because the way that I use layers to sort of help me organize on a page to page basis at a bare bones level, each panel has its own layer folder for me, so I'm able to sort of compartmentalize it, do layer masks and do all sorts of things that only apply to that panel, and it's great. It does mean that the layer counts get up to, you are now creating layer 78. And I am a bit of a layer gremlin in that I don't name my layers. So
Oh
it's like,
no.
all right, let's see. Which one did I put the shading on? Is it layer 9 or is it layer 42? I don't know. Let's figure this out.
Oh my gosh, that's such chaos.
I feel like my personal work rarely goes above kind of 20 or 30 layers. I have like I do try to name my layers. So if I don't, it's kind of because I like slacked off for a little bit, but I'll usually go back in and like name layers after the second or third time I've opened up a file, just because it always bothers me when I'm like trying to find what I was working on. And I often use like overlay layers that go on top of the whole piece so that I can kind of tweak the overall color values. Like I'll just have like a big layer at the top of the stack that is just, a few gradients in orange or purple or something. And it's all set at like, 10% opacity. But it means that I can't use some of the little tricks that softwares like Photoshop and Clip Studio give you, where when you click on an element to move it around, it'll jump you down to that layer. Because every single time I do that, it'll jump me to the overlay layer at the very top. So I like being able to have the names so I can just scroll through it and kind of pick them out on my own. But when it comes to layer chaos, I've seen some things because working in animation in the design department, I see like I'll get files and they have all these template elements that are included already, and you also will often try to save every single sketch iteration as like a hidden group or something so that it's editable and you can retrieve it later. And I've had files where when I went to create a layer, it's like layer 3356.
Oh,
um
I
Lord.
feel
so
better
i
now.
i don't think all of those layers were like in the file at the same time, but like at some point it's passed through multiple hands and that many were created and maybe deleted later, but
Oh
the
gosh.
PSD remembers.
And then you get the direction of, yeah, now we want to go back to layer 4. Thank you.
Yeah, pretty well.
Oh,
I think at a certain point, like just start a new one, start a new one from scratch. My actual layer structures when I work on comics are very straightforward these days. I'll start the file. I work in Clip Studio these days mostly, so I'll open it. It'll have like, a white background layer and one hidden layer. I'll create a set of 3 sketch layers that are in a group collected together, and the group is named Sketch. And one is for characters, one is for background, and one is for like freebies, like if there's monsters or middle ground stuff, sometimes another layer for effects. And I'll kind of stick to those until I'm done the sketch. And then I'll create 2 new groups, one of which is for inks, and I'll ink the whole thing. And then I'll have another group that is for colors, and they're all split up the same way again. It's like characters, backgrounds, and then effects and props and whatnot. And then, the panel borders will have kind of their own layer set. And then any like gradient effects that are applied to the whole piece, like those all sit in an additional layer on top of everything else. So I try to keep everything like grouped and named so that when I open the file, like I immediately know where everything is and like I can find it all super easily.
Yeah, that's important. It's important to be able to like rework with your file, I think. I think I'm somewhere between Rennie and Thane because I do things per panel. I use the thing in Clip Studio where you can make a layer folder for a panel, and then I use the slice panel tool to create different folders. So I'll have a folder for each panel, but within that, I will have the sketch layer, maybe a background sketch layer, and then inks, and then colors. I do actually separate out my colors. I used to separate out my colors very strictly, like every single thing I would say, okay, the skin is on one layer and the hair is on one
That's
layer and
just
then
too
the shirt
much.
is on one layer and different articles of clothing were on different layers. Like it was so much. And I had it in my head when I was first starting out, like, well, what if I want to change their shirt to be blue? It'll be really easy if the shirt is just on its own layer. And then I can use like the hue adjustments or something to turn it to blue. Like this is great, but like the amount of times I needed to change somebody's shirt to blue were next to none, and the number of times I had to like find things to like actually edit them were much more frequent than that. So eventually I chilled out about that. I still do a different layer per character for colors. So each character will have a layer for their colors, and I do find that if I'm shifting things around, that's helpful for me, and then the background will have its own color layer. I do overlay layers as well. For illustrations, I do what you do, Thane, and I just put overlay layer on the top. I bump it down to like 60 or 70% opacity. And then I dump some either some gradients on it, some circular gradients or maybe a linear one. And I do find it helps tie your values together if you've colored the characters and they're much more saturated maybe, or and the background is kind of a different value, and they don't actually look like they're in the same scene. Like sometimes a quick and cheaty fix is to like throw an overlay layer on it, and that kind of brings it all together. It's kind of the rug that brings it all together. So yeah, I find that can help a lot, especially with illustrations, but sometimes also with panels.
I do that a lot with specific panels that need certain moods, where sometimes color picking is hard. And since I do all my flats on one layer, I do separate the flats for the characters from the flats from the background most of the time. Sometimes I don't, and I just go, close enough for just for speed purposes. But I do love the gradient overlay or tone or gradient changes to the tone is such a good little cheat to get like a good feel, like, oh, I didn't color this just right for nighttime stuff, slap a gradient on, it'll be good. Because like you do got to remember that
Yeah.
most panels people only spend maybe 3 to 5 seconds on. So don't go don't lose yourself on it unless it's a panel that like really matters to you. So
Yeah, I think there are some people who have a lot of pride in like, okay, well, I'm gonna get it right the first try, or if you're coming from a traditional background where like you don't have that option, and you kind of have to like work on your colors like in the moment and stuff. But even if you have traditional comics, I think you could like pull them in and like adjust colors with layers. I think that's allowed.
I know people who do that.
I absolutely did that.
Yeah, just because, like, especially when you scan things or when you take like photography of it, if it's a traditional piece, sometimes a lot of the colors can get a little weird with whatever camera or scanner you're using. So using those overlay layers for that for correction are really good.
Yeah, I definitely do that a lot when I'm scanning in traditional work. Like there's a certain amount of stuff any scanner will tend to do things to the like to the piece. Usually it'll make it look a little bit washed out and maybe a little bit reddish or a little bit yellowish or a little bit bluish. So I usually do a little bit of kind of adjustment after the fact. One thing, speaking of certain layer types, this isn't quite a layer style, but it's just something that I've started doing habitually. This might be another thing that I've picked up because of my background in animation now that I've been so trained to look at everything from the position of like, how do I make this as easy for a hypothetical future person who may or may not be a stranger to go in and edit this like 2 years later down the line? And one thing that I've started doing to like raw scans, if I have an illustration that I really like, and I want to have like a nice copy of it that I can make into prints or something like that, but I need to do some work on the scan. But I know the scan is going to contain like data, and say if I adjust like the levels or I adjust the hue and saturation, I go like a little bit farther than I mean to, and I can't get details back and I save it or something. What I'll do these days, instead of doing those adjustments directly on the file itself, like on the image, I'll use adjustment layers instead, where you can actually create a layer that instead of being like, the transparency that you paint onto, it's creating like your adjustment, like the hue saturation value slider or levels or curves or like gradient map or whatever. You can make that into its own layer and give it a mask and whatnot. And then you can edit how much you want those sliders to be moved around. So, like, say I want to change the hue to be a little bit more reddish, a little more into the red end of the spectrum, and I want to reduce the saturation by like 23%, and I want to increase the lightness by like 10%, and I want to do the levels and just kind of crunch up those values a little bit. I can do those as adjustment layers, which I can then save as a layered PDF file. And then when I open it again, and I'm like, actually, I don't like how desaturated that looks, I can increase the saturation again by a little bit, or like I can change that stuff around after the fact, and it's very handy.
Yeah, what's really nice about adjustment layers too is that if you have a batch of different images and you all need them to be adjusted the exact same way, then you can just throw that adjustment layer into a new document.
Or multiple adjustment layers, like Photoshop will let you duplicate whole groups of files into another document. So I'll often group them together, and then if I am doing a whole bunch of scans that all need to be treated the same way, I can either duplicate the group out into every file, or I can set up an action that will create those layers in the exact same way multiple times.
Yeah, I love the batch settings that you can pull off in Clip and in Photoshop, I guess. The one thing I will say about creating auto actions is I use auto actions all the time. They're wonderful. I mostly use those at the end when I'm sort of finishing up a piece, when I know I want to tweak, add that little RGB to it, and make it that retro feel. Auto actions sometimes do not get along with pre-existing layers. So sometimes you'll go in, it assumes that the layer state on the image was the same as when the auto action itself was created. So if it's different at all, you can get some really weird results. So I do recommend that like you save a lot of like the heavy auto actions for like sort of end step, when you can sort of create a separate version of it that's has everything flattened before you do those auto actions. It can save a lot of headache in the little futzing of the details over it.
Yeah, there's some like funky tricks and tools that you can do at the end of a piece or a comic page or whatever that can make the illustration look really neat, but doing them involves like duplicating the whole image, which I always have a hard time with because I want to keep every layer. I don't want to flatten it and then work on it some more. I need to do everything before I flatten.
We're layer hoarders.
Yeah, you do need to like have all of your layers and then you do a copy that is a flattened version. I know in Photoshop, I don't know how to do it in Clip Studio, but in Photoshop if you select all and you control shift C, like you're copying and pasting, but you add the shift key, it will make a copy of every visible layer that you can
Oh.
see in the document. And then you do control V, and that's just it pastes it as its own layer, and it's a flat version, and all of your other layers are still intact. I use that a lot.
Clip Studio has this thing called merge visible to new layer where you just right click any layer and it's up right above the flattened image, which and then you can copy that. And what I usually do is I copy that and then I go up to file and say create new from clipboard, and then I can do all the funky weird edits to it outside of the file, so I
Oh,
know I'm
man.
not breaking anything.
Yeah.
This just reminded me of one of the craziest things that I like to do with my layers in Photoshop, which to my knowledge Clip Studio does not have an analog to this yet, with the caveat that like Clip Studio 2 is coming out and maybe they will. But one thing that I use and abuse in Photoshop, especially at work, is smart objects, which are basically you can say you have like, I don't know, within your page you have this really cool amulet that looks neat and you spend a lot of time rendering it and it looks amazing and you want to reuse that across like a bunch of other pages, or you want to like do more stuff with it. You can gather together those layers and right click and set that as a smart object, and it'll turn that all of those layers or that group or whatever into a single layer basically that you can treat as if it was just a normal layer. You can like control T to transform it. You can like set the whole thing to multiply or overlay. You can even do like warp transforms on it. You can treat it like it's a normal layer, except if you double click it, you'll get taken to another document which still has all your layers. So you can go back in and you can edit the color of the line art, or you can add another cool overlay layer, or like you can change a bunch of things around. I really like using it for repeating elements like logos and stuff like that. And I use it on the daily at work where I might need to have like a large version of something and then a small version of something elsewhere on a template. And whenever I make changes to the main thing, all those changes will like repeat themselves everywhere that object appears. So I don't have to like recopy it and retransform it down into that corner wherever else it appears. But it can be handy for like, I mean, in theory, you could use it to take every layer from your whole illustration and turn that into a smart object. And then you can just keep duplicating it and tweaking those layer formats and doing funky stuff to them and giving them Gaussian blurs and like setting it to overlay on top of itself, that sort of thing. The downside is it can make a file get very heavy, and also if you're working between multiple programs, like only Photoshop will support it. So if I was making use of these in my comic pages, I'd be like out of luck as soon as I opened it in Clip Studio. It would just appear as like a single normal layer. But it's a really neat tool, and I wish that the other softwares had it too, because gosh, I overuse the heck out of them.
Yeah. I use it for work too, and specifically vector smart objects. So I can have like a logo or something like that, and I paste it as a smart object into Photoshop, which is a raster program, but I can still open this smart object in my vector program, and it'll open it up in Illustrator, and then I can still retain the vector elements. And so, quick crash course on raster versus vector. Vector is kind of just made of geometry and lines and points and stuff. So basically you tell something to be 2 times bigger, everything scales, all of your formulas scale, and so you don't lose anything because you're not trying to stretch pixels to be bigger. That's what
It's
raster is.
math art.
It's math art. Yeah. So basically I have my logos and stuff if I'm doing book layouts or whatever. All of those are vector smart objects, and that way I can make the logo bigger and put it around, wherever I need to and retain the quality, but it's in a raster program, which is what I need for editing, but it is still, it retains its vector stuff. I know Clip Studio has vector layers. It's not exactly the same as a vector smart object, but it does have some, you can make a vector layer, and a lot of people will use those for their line art. And so you get that nice thing where all the points are there and you can adjust the points, you can move the points around and still preserve the integrity of the line. And it even kind of respects line weight variation with the weight of your line. So that's something I've checked out. I don't know that it gives me quite the lines that I want, but I know a lot of people swear by it.
I guess the other thing that we wanted to touch on was I use layer masking constantly. And what that does is it basically takes a portion of a page and it sort of blocks it out and says, nothing that you draw will go inside or outside this area. It's very, very cool. I use it daily whenever I'm applying shading or effects to the characters, and that I don't want to spread out, or if I want it to be on this character but not another one. It's so handy.
I really like using layer masks for if I ever, like, say I've drawn the characters and then there's something in the foreground of the shot that's like overlapping with them or something like that. Instead of erasing out the part of the character line work that I spend all that time drawing, I'll use a layer mask. And then if I ever need to move them around elsewhere, because I didn't erase that data, I can get it back. Like I can turn off the layer mask, or I can move it, or I can redo it in some other way. They're really neat for it. It's like you're erasing something, but you have more control because the mask itself is basically a black and white image. And wherever you paint black on that image, there's no, like, whatever appears on that layer will be transparent. And wherever you paint white on the mask, it'll be fully opaque. So you can even have gradients in your layer mask, and you can have it go through all these different shades of gray and use a fuzzy brush or change the type of brush as you're erasing. I made air quotes around that, but you can't hear those. Just little tricks to let you keep more of your actual art and potentially reuse it later elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's like the basic principle of how Clip Studio's layer panels work, because they're saying like the panel is a masked folder, and you can apply masks to layers, but you can also apply them to entire folders. So that's one way. If you want to do panels, even if you're not using Clip Studio, you can do like a layer mask to say, okay, here is the rectangle in which panel 1 is sitting. And so even if I do a large brush stroke that goes outside the boundaries of the panel, it won't cross over into any of the other panels. And I find that's really helpful. One other thing that I use a lot is lock transparency. So this comes up a lot when I'm coloring. You can draw something and color it and stuff, and then you lock the transparency. And then whatever you do, it's kind of like a layer mask, only you're not actually putting any kind of data outside of your masked area. You're just confining whatever you're drawing to the pixels that already exist on that layer. And so when you're coloring, when you're shading, if you want to do like a gradient up or something like that, or even just keeping things like keeping, if you wanted to do like lock transparency on your inks and then recolor your inks so that maybe you have a sepia toned ink, or maybe you do like a part where it gets lighter and it goes to a gradient. That's another thing that you can do with lock transparent pixels. It's so fun.
There is another thing. So this isn't exactly the same as locking transparency. And this is something that has a name, which I feel throws off people when they're first starting to learn about it. But there's a function called clipping masks. And what a clipping mask is, it's not even really a mask. It's like you're linking one layer to the layer underneath it. So so in the case of the line art, for instance, you have your line art layer, which has like all your cool drawings on it. You make a new layer on top of that, and then you can go through the menu and hit set as clipping layer, or you can use the hotkey Control Alt G. It's the same in Clip Studio and in Photoshop. And basically a little line will appear, like that upper layer will get shifted over just a little bit to the right, and there'll be like a little line that appears beside it that'll show you that it's now been connected to the layer underneath it. And you can paint whatever the heck you want on that upper layer, all kinds of colors, all kinds of gradients, whatever. And nothing, it'll show up as if you're painting onto
I do that so much.
the bottom layer, but with its transparency locked. And the fun thing about that, it is really neat. I actually use it for my character, like the shading and stuff. Like I'll have the flat colors for my characters, and then I'll set a layer on top of it for the shadows, and I'll set that layer to multiply. Because that's the cool thing about the clipping masks, is that you can do all this painting and stuff, but because it's its own layer, you can use layer styles and you can set it to multiply or overlay or linear light or whatever. And then you do all your painting of your shadows. You don't have to worry about going outside of your flats because that layer is tethered. I use these a lot too.
They're my absolute favorite, and they speed up the process of making the page so much.
And then you can combine all of it, and then you have a smart object with a clipping mask on top of it, and you lock the transparency of the.
Oh my goodness. Like the traditional artists have just tuned out at this point. They're just like, what are you talking about? Locking what? Blah, 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 blah.
I started as one of you, but I can't go back now.
You were the chosen one.
No, you can't go back. What are your guys' favorite layer styles, layer types?
Color dodge every time. Every single page, every single illustration, I gotta have that glowy color dodge.
Oh yeah. It's good for glows. It's so good for if you're doing magic or something like that, then because it intensifies like the lights of that layer. So all the values that are lighter versus darker will kind of pop when you do that.
I feel like multiply and overlay are my workhorses that I definitely utilize the most, just because they're fairly controllable. Like multiply especially, I can use it for my shading, and like I always kind of know what it's going to do. And overlay tends to give everything this really nice kind of luminosity, because it'll always push the saturation just a little. But I think one of my latest favorites is linear light, which I've been using for a lot of my effects in Witchwood recently, to get that like that the glowy looks. Because I feel like I used to use screen a lot for that, but screen tends to stay kind of low on the saturation scale. And then I would have to also add like an overlay layer on top of that to try to get that saturation back in. But linear light tends to amplify saturation like crazy. It can be a little bit hard to control. Like if you use it with a color that's dark or on top of a color that's dark, it'll get like very intense, like almost too much. So I'm always having to kind of pull it back and do a little bit of tweaking, but it's a lot of fun to watch it in action.
Yeah, I will definitely stand by multiply and overlay as my workhorses too, because multiply is just nice if you want something to fade to black or you want something darker so that like text will stand out on it. Like that's a pretty easy one to just kind of throw a black gradient, black to transparent gradient on there, set it to multiply. It'll be fine. You can adjust the opacity of it, but overlay, I think, is just at the end of the day my favorite. I like to do kind of cool to warm gradients. So like I'll start from the edges, the outer edges of my piece and do like a purple or a blue or some kind of cool color and then just bring that out from the edges and then get my circular gradient and do like an orangey or a yellowy or something like that and throw that especially on faces, on skin, on like the focal point of where I want people to be looking. And then I set that gradient layer to overlay. I adjust the opacity so it doesn't look like people have sunburns. And yeah, I think it just adds just this very nice quality, that kind of a rainbowy effect on the piece. And I do think it's important to say that you can go overboard with this kind of stuff, especially if in the context of comic pages, maybe you don't want to pull out all the stops on every single one. So, experiment with layers, do what you want to do, just like play with illustrations and stuff and maybe put all of your like amazing stuff there, but yeah, kind of see what you like, choose a couple, integrate them into your comic making process, and they can really help you in various different ways.
I feel like one of the nice things about when it comes to layer styles is that you can make them something that is repeatable and easy after you kind of land on something that you like. So like I have like a handful of things, capital T things that I do to my pages right at the very end, where I'll throw on like one overlay layer and then maybe another overlay layer and then like a texture layer, and that's it. But it's the same things on every page. So I'm not really spending like, I got the tweaking out of the way at the beginning until I arrived at something that I generally liked the look of. And then I'm like, all right, now I'm just going to do that. And I'm not going to spend like too much time noodling with like, do I want another layer? Is it 2% opacity or 3% opacity? It is easy to get stuck in that kind of loop of like really, really trying to fine tune these things. But there's a certain point where you can just be like, I'm done. It's finished.
For the amount that some people look at comic panels, it's just like people are not going to know the difference between 2% and 3% opacity. Just leave it alone. But yeah, layers. They're like ogres. They're big. They're green sometimes, and they want to know why you're in the swamp. Um
I'm in the swamp to print a run of t-shirts that say Overlay Fan Club.
Oh, okay.
Do you want one?
Yes, I do.
Oh, I want one of those shirts.
I need that. Yes, for sure. Okay, I think that's a wrap. I have been Delphina. You can find my comic Somnolus at somnolus.com.
And I've been Verathane, and you can find my comics at charalt.sevensmith.net or at witchwoodcomic.com.
I've been Rennie. You can find my comic at kateblast.com.
Okay, now where is the swamp layer? I need to find the swamp layer. Is it like a muck sort of thing that you can? Because we didn't really talk about like mucky textures. I think that would be.
It makes it. It's the one that makes it all like sort of.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. We are supported in part by the fantastic folks at Hiveworks, home of many amazing independent webcomics. Check out their store at hivemill.com to find ebooks and print books of many fine Hiveworks titles. We're also supported by, well, listeners like you over on Ko-fi. Drop us a few bucks if you enjoy what we do and want to help us continue talking about anything and everything webcomics. And don't forget to give us a follow on Blue Sky and Tumblr so you don't miss an episode. You can find links to all of those at screentonescast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.